cops who have arrested your friend. What happened? Story 1. I had been on the force for about 3 years when I had to arrest my closest friend, another cop. We grew up together, went through the academy side by side, and even ended up working in the same precinct. Everything was going fine until I started hearing rumors that he was getting involved with some shady business, specifically protecting a local gang in exchange for money. I didn't believe it at first. I mean, this guy was practically my brother, but the rumors kept coming, and then one night I saw it with my own eyes. We were both patrolling different sectors, and I saw his cruiser parked in a sketchy alleyway. I thought nothing of it at first until I noticed the familiar faces of gang members loading something into his car. I pulled over, hoping it was a misunderstanding. When I approached, he gave me a look that said it all. He tried to explain, saying he was doing it for his family, that he needed the money. My heart sank. I told him I had to take him in. He didn't fight back, didn't run, he just nodded and handed me his badge. I arrested him that night. The hardest part wasn't the paperwork or the court hearings that followed. It was realizing I had to choose between my duty and a friend. He ended up serving time, and we haven't spoken since. The whole thing left a bad taste in my mouth, but I'd do it again because it was the right thing to do. Still, that night haunts me. Story 2. I never thought I'd have to arrest one of my childhood friends, but it happened. We grew up together, went to the same schools, and stayed close even after life took us on different paths. He always had a wild side, but I never thought it would lead to anything serious. One night, I got a call for a disturbance at a bar. When I arrived, it was chaos. Glass was shattered, and people were shouting. As I pushed through the crowd, I saw him. My friend, completely wasted, was in a heated argument with the bartender. The bartender was furious, saying my friend had refused to pay his tab and had started threatening people. I couldn't believe it. I tried to pull him aside, calm him down, but he was belligerent, saying the bartender was lying. Things escalated quickly. He swung at me, catching me off guard. At that moment, I knew I had no choice. I grabbed his arm, cuffed him, and walked him out of the bar while people stared. He spent the night in a cell to sober up, and when I saw him the next day, he couldn't even look me in the eye. He apologized, but our friendship was never the same after that. I hated that it came to this, but I had to do what was right. Story 3. A few years ago, I got a call that one of my old college buddies had been picked up for driving under the influence. It was surreal because this was the guy who had always been the responsible one in our group, always had his life together. When I arrived at the station, he was sitting in the holding cell looking completely out of it. I talked to the officer who pulled him over, and apparently he had been swerving all over the road, barely able to keep his car in his lane. They said he reeked of alcohol and failed the breathalyzer miserably. When I went over to him, he was too drunk to even recognize me at first. It was awkward, standing there knowing I'd have to go through the process of booking him. As I filled out the paperwork, he started sobbing, telling me his life had spiraled out of control since his divorce, that drinking was the only thing that made him feel better. I didn't know what to say. We used to be so close, but we had drifted apart over the years. Arresting him felt like the final nail in the coffin of a friendship that had already faded. After he sobered up, I drove him home, and we barely spoke during the ride. We haven't really talked since that night. It's like both of us knew things had changed for good. Story 4. I was out with a group of friends at a bar one night when things took a wild turn. One of my closest friends, who had been drinking heavily, started getting into it with another guy over something trivial, probably about whose turn it was to play pool. The situation escalated fast, and before I knew it, my friend threw a punch, knocking the guy down. It turned into an all-out brawl with people stepping in, fists flying everywhere. The bouncers came in to break it up, and in the chaos, the police were called. When the cops arrived, they started questioning everyone. One of the officers pulled me aside, recognizing me from another incident a few months back. We exchanged quick pleasantries, but then I realized my friend was still going off, shouting at the guy he hit and even pushing one of the officers. It got to the point where the cops had to restrain him, and I saw the look in the officer's eyes. He was about to arrest my friend. I felt torn. This was someone I had known for years, but I couldn't stop what was happening. They cuffed him and put him in the squad car, and as they drove off, I just stood there, feeling like I had failed him somehow. The next day after he was released, we talked. He was embarrassed and angry, but I think that night changed things for both of us. It wasn't just a night out anymore. It was the moment our friendship started to unravel. Story 5. A few years ago, I ran into my old high school best friend, who I hadn't seen in years. We reconnected over coffee, shared some laughs, and reminisced about the good old days. He seemed a little off, but I didn't think much of it at the time. A couple of weeks later, we made plans to grab dinner. As we were eating, he casually mentioned he was having some trouble with the law, but didn't go into details. I tried to ask him what was going on, but he brushed it off, saying it was nothing serious. Fast forward to a Friday night, I was out with some coworkers when I got a frantic call from another friend. He told me my high school buddy had been arrested for robbery. I was in complete shock. This was the guy I had grown up with, someone I trusted. I couldn't believe it. When I went to visit him in jail, he admitted to everything. Apparently, he had fallen into some bad habits and needed money fast. I was devastated, not just because of what he had done, but because he hadn't reached out for help before it got this far. Seeing him in that jumpsuit sitting behind glass was surreal. We had been inseparable in high school, and now it felt like I didn't know him at all. It was a turning point in our friendship. He got sentenced to a couple of years, and though I tried to stay in touch, our lives had clearly taken very different paths. I still think about him sometimes, wondering how things could have been different if he had just asked for help earlier. Story 6. A few years ago, I reconnected with a friend from high school through social media. We weren't best friends back in the day, but we hung out in the same group and always got along well. After exchanging a few messages, we decided to meet up for drinks and catch up on life. It was a fun evening, full of nostalgia, and everything seemed great. Over the next few months, we hung out regularly, and it felt like we were building a solid friendship again. One night, I got a call from him, but instead of our usual banter, he sounded panicked. He asked if I could come pick him up from a bar in Aparta, town that wasn't exactly safe. I drove over, and when I got there, he was standing outside with a nervous look on his face. As soon as he got in my car, he started rambling about how he had messed up, but he wouldn't tell me exactly what had happened. A few days later, I found out from a mutual friend that he had been involved in some kind of small-time drug deal that went wrong. He was in deep, and it was only a matter of time before he got caught. Sure enough, a couple of weeks later, I heard that he had been arrested. He didn't contact me after that, and I didn't reach out either. I realized that despite the fun memories we shared, we were on completely different paths now, and I had to distance myself from the situation. It was a harsh reminder that sometimes people from your past are better left in the past. Story 7. I hadn't seen my best friend from college in years, but we always stayed in touch through social media. We used to be inseparable back in the day, and even though life took us in different directions, I always thought of him as a brother. One day, he called me out of the blue, saying he was in town and wanted to catch up. We made plans to meet at a local bar, and I was excited to see him after so long. When I got there, it was like no time had passed. We started talking about the old days, laughing at our shared stories, and it felt great. But as the night went on, I noticed something was off. He kept checking his phone nervously and looking over his shoulder. I finally asked him if everything was okay, and that's when he dropped the bombshell. He told me he was in serious trouble with some dangerous people and needed to lay low for a while. He didn't go into much detail, but he asked if he could crash at my place for a few days. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. He was my friend, but I wasn't sure I wanted to get involved in whatever mess he was in. Still, I agreed to let him stay. That night, there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, two guys I didn't recognize were standing there, asking about my friend. They weren't cops, and their presence made me uneasy. I told them I hadn't seen him in years and quickly shut the door. The next morning, I told my friend he had to leave. I couldn't risk my safety or get involved in whatever dangerous situation he was mixed up in. He understood and left without argument, but we haven't spoken since. It was a hard decision, but I knew I had to protect myself. Story 8. I hadn't seen my friend Dave since high school, so when I bumped into him at a gas station one evening, it was a pleasant surprise. We caught up quickly, shared a laugh about old times, and exchanged numbers. A few days later, he called me up, asking if I wanted to grab a drink. We met at a local bar, and everything seemed normal at first, but the more we drank, the more I started noticing how much he had changed. He seemed anxious and constantly checking his phone, and when I asked him about it, he just shrugged it off. As the night went on, Dave told me he had fallen on hard times and needed a place to crash for a night or two. I didn't think much of it. After all, we were old friends, so I told him he could stay at my place. Around midnight, we were hanging out in my living room when there was a loud knock on the door. Dave's face went pale, and he motioned for me to stay quiet. Before I could react, the door burst open, and two guys stormed in. Turns out, Dave had been running from some loan sharks, and they had tracked him down. They started demanding money and threatening him right there in my living room. I had no idea what to do, but I told them I didn't want any trouble. Eventually they left, but not before making it clear that they'd be back. The next morning I kicked Dave out. I couldn't risk getting dragged into his mess, no matter how much I cared about him. We haven't spoken spoken since, and I sometimes wonder what happened to him, but I knew I had made the right choice. Story 9. Back in college, I reconnected with my old high school friend Sarah. We weren't super close in high school, but we had always gotten along well. After a random run-in at a coffee shop, we decided to hang out more. She seemed different though, more on edge, constantly checking her phone and making odd comments about people owing her money. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just stress. One evening, she invited me to a party at her place. I didn't think much of it, and we had a good time catching up. But things took a weird turn when one of her friends pulled me aside and asked if I knew Sarah was dealing drugs. I was shocked. I confronted her, and she admitted that she had been selling small amounts to pay off some debts. She laughed it off like it wasn't a big deal, but I was uncomfortable. A couple of weeks later, Sarah asked me to come over, saying she needed help with something. When I arrived, I found her in a panic. She was pacing around, talking about how someone she owed money to was coming over and she didn't know what to do. I told her to go to the police, but she refused, saying it would make things worse. The next thing I knew, 3 guys showed up at her door, demanding payment. Things escalated quickly, and one of them pushed Sarah against the wall. I stepped in, trying to calm things down, but I could tell this wasn't going to end well. They eventually left, warning her that they'd be back. That was the last straw for me. I cut ties with Sarah that night. It was a tough decision, but I couldn't let her drag me into her dangerous world. I haven't heard from her since, and honestly, I hope she got out of that mess. Story 10. A few years ago, I ran into my high school friend Mike at a local bar. We hadn't seen each other in years, so we grabbed a couple of beers and started catching up. Mike had always been the life of the party back in school, and it seemed like nothing had changed. He was still full of stories, always cracking jokes. But as the night went on, I noticed something was off. He kept looking over his shoulder and texting someone constantly. I asked him if everything was okay, and he shrugged it off, saying it was just work stuff. We decided to meet up again the following week. This time, when we hung out, Mike seemed even more distracted. He told me he'd gotten into some trouble with a few bad people and was trying to get out of it. When I pressed him for details, he admitted he owed a lot of money due to gambling and had been borrowing from some shady people to try and pay it off. I told him he needed to stop, but he insisted he had it under control. A couple of weeks later, I got a frantic call from Mike in the middle of the night. He was panicking, saying that the people he owed money to were outside his apartment demanding payment. I could hear them banging on the door in the background. I told him to call the police, but he refused, saying that would only make things worse. I drove over to his place, not knowing what to expect. When I got there, the guys were gone, but Mike was a mess. He was scared out of his mind. I stayed with him that night, but I knew I couldn't keep getting involved. After that, Mike disappeared. He stopped answering my calls and texts. A mutual friend later told me that he had moved out of town to start fresh somewhere else. I hope he's doing okay, but I haven't heard from him since.